Picture this, a church bell tolling, white silk flowing in the wind, and hooves thundering across cobblestones as a woman's desperate scream cuts through the Sunday morning air. In one split second, everything changed for Clara Bennett. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. One moment she was walking down the aisle toward a future she never wanted, and the next she was flying through the air in the arms of a stranger who would turn her entire world upside down. But this isn't just another rescue story. This is about the moment when a preacher's daughter discovered that sometimes the greatest act of faith is choosing your own path, even when it means breaking every rule you've ever known. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street, painting the town square in shades of gold and amber that should have felt like a blessing. Instead, Clara Bennett stood at her bedroom window, watching the bustle below with a heart heavy. As lead, carriages lined the street, their polished surfaces gleaming in the early light, while well-dressed folks stepped down onto the wooden sidewalks, all heading towards St. Matthew's Methodist Church. Her wedding day had arrived like a storm she'd seen coming from miles away but couldn't outrun. 22 years old, with auburn hair that caught fire in sunlight and green eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of adventure beyond Millbrook's borders, Clara had always been different from the other preachers' daughters. While they embroidered samplers with biblical verses, she climbed trees and read books about distant lands. While they practiced perfect posture for tea parties, she helped her father tend to the sick and poor, learning that true faith meant getting your hands dirty in service to others. But being different had come at a price, and today that bill was due in full. "Clara, sweetheart, it's time." Her father's voice drifted through the oak door, gentle but weighted with something she couldn't quite name. Reverend Samuel Bennett had always been her champion, the one person who understood her restless spirit and encouraged her questions about faith, life, and what lay beyond their small town's borders. But 3 months ago, something had changed. The light in his eyes had dimmed, and conversations that once flowed like rivers between them had become stilted, careful things. She pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching as Theodore Whitmore III stepped down from his family's ornate carriage. Even from her second-story window, she could see the way he checked his pocket watch, adjusted his silk cravat, and surveyed the gathering crowd with the calculating gaze of a man who viewed everything, including his bride-to-be, as another business acquisition. At 28, Theodore was everything Millbrook society considered a perfect match. Wealthy, educated, connected to powerful families across 3 states, and heir to the largest lumber operation in East Texas. He was also as cold as a January morning and twice as unforgiving. The arrangement had been presented to her as a blessing, a providential match that would secure her future and bring prosperity to their humble family. Charles Whitmore, Theodore's father, had approached Reverend Bennett with an offer that seemed too generous to refuse. A substantial donation to the church's expansion fund, a new house for the Bennett family, and the promise that Clara would want for nothing as long as she lived. "Think of the good we could do with such resources," her father had said, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "The families we could help, the children we could feed, the hope we could bring to those who have so little." But Clara had seen something else in her father's eyes that day, something that made her stomach clench with worry, fear, not fear of poverty or hardship, but something deeper, more immediate. When she'd pressed him about it, he'd simply said that sometimes God's will came in unexpected packages, and it was their duty to trust even when understanding seemed impossible. The truth had come to her in pieces, like fragments of a shattered mirror that cut her hands as she tried to put them back together. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, worried glances between her father and Nancy Porter, their neighbor who helped with the church's charitable work, bills hidden beneath other papers on her father's desk. And finally, the devastating revelation that had made everything clear: the church was in debt. Not just struggling financially, but drowning in obligations that threatened to close their doors forever. The expansion fund her father had worked toward for 5 years had been depleted by a series of emergencies: repairs after the spring floods, medical bills for families who couldn't pay, supplies for the growing number of homeless men passing through town looking for work. Reverend Bennett had given everything he had and more, borrowing against the church property itself to keep serving his community. Charles Whitmore held those debts now, purchased from the bank, with the casual efficiency of a man collecting playing cards. One word from him could see the church foreclosed, her father stripped of his calling, and dozens of families left without the support that kept them from destitution. The marriage wasn't just an arrangement, it was ransom. Clara's reflection stared back at her from the window, pale and resolute in her white silk dress. The gown was beautiful, she had to admit, with intricate lacework that had taken 3 seamstresses 2 weeks to complete. It had been Charles Whitmore's gift, along with everything else she wore: the pearl necklace that felt like a collar around her throat, the delicate slippers that would never survive a walk through Millbrook's muddy streets, and the veil that transformed her from a woman into a symbol of something she'd never chosen to represent. "Clara?" Her father's voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. She turned from the window and opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, dressed in his best black suit with his Bible tucked under his arm. At 55, Samuel Bennett was still a handsome man, tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair and kind eyes that had comforted countless souls through their darkest hours. But today those eyes couldn't quite meet hers, and the weight of what lay unspoken between them seemed to bow his shoulders. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice catching slightly on the words. "Papa." She reached for his hands, finding them cold despite the warm morning. "We could run right now, pack what we can carry and leave Millbrook behind. There are other towns, other churches that need pastors. We could start over somewhere new." For a moment, hope flickered across his features like sunlight through clouds. Then reality settled back over him like a heavy cloak. "And leave Mrs. Henderson without medicine for her arthritis." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let the Murphy children go hungry when their father can't find work? Turn our backs on everyone who depends on the church's help? Clara's throat tightened. She'd known what his answer would be before she'd asked, but hearing it still felt like a door slamming shut on her last hope of escape. Her father had spent his entire adult life putting others' needs before his own, and he wouldn't stop now, even if it meant sacrificing his daughter's happiness on the altar of his calling. "There has to be another way," she whispered. "If there was, don't you think I would have found it?" The anguish in his voice nearly broke her heart. "I've prayed, Clara. I've searched every possibility, consulted with other pastors, even considered writing to the denominational headquarters for help. But the debts are too large, and time has run out. Charles Whitmore is not an evil man, just a businessman who expects value for his investments. Theodore will provide for you, protect you, give you a life of comfort and security, but not love," Clara said quietly. Her father's silence was answer enough. A knock at the front door echoed through the house, followed by Nancy Porter's voice calling out that the carriage was ready. Clara's wedding carriage, decorated with white ribbons and pulled by matching grey horses, waited to carry her the 3 blocks to St. Matthew's Methodist Church, where Theodore Whitmore III would be waiting at the altar with a ring that felt more like shackles than jewelry. As they descended the stairs together, Clara caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror, The woman looking back at her was elegant, refined, and completely unrecognizable. Gone was the girl who'd climbed trees in worn calico dresses and helped deliver food to struggling families. In her place stood a stranger dressed in silk and pearls, a perfect ornament for a wealthy man's arm. "Papa," she said as they reached the front door, "what if God's will isn't what we think it is? What if he has a different plan?" Samuel Bennett paused with his hand on the doorknob, his shoulders sagging under the weight of choices that had led them to this moment. "Then I pray he'll forgive me for not being strong enough to wait for it." The carriage ride to the church passed in a blur of familiar streets, transformed by the gravity of the occasion. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, waving and calling out blessings, their faces bright with excitement for what they saw as a fairy tale romance. If only they knew the truth, that their beloved preacher's daughter was being traded like livestock to save a building made of wood and stone. St. Matthew's Methodist Church stood at the corner of Main and Elm, its white-painted walls and simple bell tower a beacon of hope that had guided Millbrook's faithful for over 30 years. Today, it was decorated with garlands of late summer flowers and white ribbon, transforming the humble building into something that belonged in a wealthy city rather than their small Texas town. The transformation felt symbolic somehow, as if the church itself was being dressed up for sale. Inside, the sanctuary was packed with nearly everyone in Millbrook and dozens of visitors from neighboring towns. The Whitmore family had spared no expense, filling the simple space with elaborate floral arrangements, silk bows on every pew, and enough candles to illuminate a cathedral. At the front of the church, Theodore waited with his groomsmen, his blonde hair perfectly styled and his expression pleasantly confident, like a man who'd never doubted the outcome of any negotiation. Clara's steps slowed as she approached the church doors, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to gather up her skirts and flee down the street toward whatever uncertain future awaited beyond Millbrook's borders. But the faces of the families her father served flashed through her mind. Widow Henderson, counting out coins for her medicine, the Murphy children with their patched clothes and hopeful smiles, the traveling men who found hot meals and warm beds at the church when no one else would help them. How could she buy her freedom with their suffering? "It's time, sweetheart," her father said gently, offering her his arm. Clara took it, feeling like she was signing her own death warrant, and together they walked through the doors of St. Matthew's Methodist Church toward a future that felt like a tomb, dressed in white silk and wedding flowers. The organ began to play, and 300 pairs of eyes turned toward her with smiles and sighs of appreciation for her beauty. At the altar, Theodore's smile widened with satisfaction, and Charles Whitmore nodded approvingly from the front. Phew! Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, but as Clara took her first step down the aisle, a strange calm settled over her, as if she'd moved beyond panic into someplace deeper and more resolute. She might be walking toward a loveless marriage, but she was doing it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. If that wasn't an act of faith, she didn't know what was. The music swelled, filling the sanctuary with notes that should have lifted her heart, but instead felt like a funeral dirge. Step by measured step, she moved toward the altar where Theodore waited, his pale blue eyes fixed on her with the focus of a man who'd just closed the most important business deal of his life. But fate, as Clara was about to discover, had other plans entirely. As she reached the halfway point of the aisle, a commotion outside began to filter through the church's open windows. Horses whinnying in distress, men shouting, the sound of wheels rattling over cobblestones at dangerous speed. The wedding guests began to murmur and turn their heads toward the windows, their attention divided between the bride and whatever chaos was unfolding in the town square just beyond the church grounds. Clara paused, her father's arm steady beneath her hand, and listened to the growing tumult outside. Something was wrong, very wrong, and every instinct she'd inherited from years of helping her father respond to emergencies told her that lives might be in danger. "Keep walking, sweetheart," her father whispered, but his own steps had slowed, his pastoral instincts warring with the social obligations of the moment. The sounds outside grew louder, more urgent, punctuated by a woman's scream that cut through the organ music like a knife through silk. Clara stopped completely, her head turning toward the windows where she could see people running past, their faces tight with panic. That's when she heard it, the thunder of hooves moving too fast, the grinding of carriage wheels fighting for purchase on stone, and underneath it all, the terrified crying of children. Someone was in terrible danger, and here she stood in a church full of people dressed in silk and pearls, pretending that her personal sacrifice was the most important thing happening in Millbrook that morning. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she'd felt like her life was a runaway carriage, racing toward a destination she couldn't escape. Now, somewhere outside these decorated walls, someone else's life was literally spiraling out of control, and she was the only person in the room who seemed to care more about their crisis than the ceremony. Clara looked ahead at Theodore, still smiling his confident smile, apparently unconcerned by the emergency unfolding outside his wedding. She looked at the wedding guests, more interested in craning their necks for a better view than offering help. She looked at her father, torn between duty and compassion, just as he'd been torn between saving his church and protecting his daughter. And in that moment, Clara Bennett made a decision that would change everything. She was done being a passenger in her own life. Whatever was happening outside, whoever needed help, she was going to provide it, even if it meant walking away from this altar, this arrangement, and everything that was supposed to secure her future. Some things mattered more than security, and some choices were worth making even when you couldn't see where they would lead. The thunder of hooves grew closer, and Clara's heart began to race with something that felt less like panic and more like anticipation. Somewhere in the chaos outside, her real story was about to begin. She just didn't know it yet. The screaming outside grew louder, more desperate, cutting through the organ music like a blade through silk. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of chains she hadn't realized were there. The woman's voice carried a terror so raw and primal that it made Clara's skin crawl with urgency. Children were crying now too, their voices high and frightened, mixing with the thunder of hooves that seemed to be getting closer to the church. Without thinking, Clara lifted her heavy silk skirts and stepped out of the center aisle, moving toward the nearest window. Her father's grip on her arm tightened, his whispered protests lost in the growing murmur of confusion from the wedding. Guests. Through the tall church windows, she could see people running in the town square, their Sunday clothes streaming behind them as they fled from something that remained just out of sight. "Clara, what are you doing?" Theodore's voice carried from the altar, sharp with irritation rather than concern. "Come back here at once." She ignored him, pressing closer to the window, where she could finally see what was causing the panic. A wedding carriage, decorated with white ribbons and pulled by 2 bay horses, was careening wildly through the town square. The animals were in full panic, their eyes rolling white with terror as they fought against their harness and each other, turning what should have been a gentle ride into a nightmare of spinning wheels and flying hooves. But it was the figures inside the carriage that made Clara's blood turn to ice. A young woman in a blue dress clung to the side of the careening vehicle, her dark hair whipping in the wind as she tried desperately to reach for something or someone. Beside her, 2 small children huddled together, their mouths open in screams that Clara could hear even through the church walls. The driver was gone. Clara could see his hat lying trampled in the dirt 20 yards behind the runaway carriage, and she realized with growing horror that the horses were completely out of control. The carriage bounced and swayed as it hit ruts in the road, and each jolt threatened to throw its passengers out onto the unforgiving cobblestones below. People were scattering in every direction, but no one seemed to know what to do. A few men were shouting and waving their arms, trying to get the horses' attention, but they were too panicked to respond to anything but their own terror. The carriage would reach the far end of the square in less than a minute, where the road curved sharply toward Miller's Creek. If those horses tried to take that turn at their current speed, the whole vehicle would overturn, and everyone inside would be killed. "Someone has to help them," Clara said, her voice cutting through the murmur of wedding guests who were now openly gawking at the chaos outside. "That's not our concern right now," Theodore snapped, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Clara, return to your place immediately. This is our wedding day, and I will not have it disrupted by some local disturbance." Clara turned to stare at him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since their engagement had been announced. Here was a man who could watch children in mortal danger and call it a local disturbance. A man whose first thought wasn't how to help, but how the emergency might inconvenience him. A man who expected her to stand in a church and speak vows of love, while ignoring the desperate cries for help just outside the windows. "Those are people out there," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Children who might, and die if someone doesn't help them. And what exactly do you propose to do about it?" Theodore's laugh held no warmth. "You're a preacher's daughter in a wedding dress, not some frontier hero. Let the men handle whatever's happening out there." The dismissal in his voice, the casual cruelty of suggesting that other people's lives mattered less than his wedding schedule, hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked around the sanctuary, seeing the faces of people she'd known her entire life, all of them watching the drama outside with varying degrees of concern and curiosity, but none of them moving to help. Except for one figure she spotted through the window, moving against the crowd instead of with it. A cowboy was running directly toward the runaway carriage, his long legs eating up the distance between him and the panicked horses. He wore working clothes, dusty boots, and a hat that had seen better days, and he moved with the fluid grace of a man who spent his life on horseback. While everyone else was running away from danger, he was running straight into it. Clara watched, transfixed, as the cowboy reached the edge of the square where his own horse was tied to a hitching post outside Porter's general store. In one smooth motion, he untied the reins, swung himself into the saddle, and spurred his mount into a gallop that brought him alongside the runaway carriage within seconds. He was trying to grab the bridle of the lead horse, Clara realized, leaning dangerously far out of his saddle to reach the panicked animal's head. But the horses were moving too fast, too erratically, and his first attempt failed. The cowboy didn't give up. He adjusted his position, his horse matching the carriage's pace stride for stride, and reached out again. This time, his fingers closed around the bridle, and Clara held her breath as she watched him try to slow the runaway team. The horses fought him, their panic making them strong and unpredictable, but the cowboy held on with grim determination. His hat flew off in the wind, revealing dark hair and a face set with fierce concentration. "Remarkable," someone murmured behind Clara, and she realized that the entire wedding party was now watching the rescue attempt. Even Theodore had moved to the windows, though his expression remained more annoyed than concerned. The cowboy was making progress, gradually slowing the horses' headlong rush toward disaster, but they were still moving too fast for the sharp turn ahead, and Clara could see that he knew it. He shouted something to the woman in the carriage, gesturing for her to grab the children and hold tight. Then he did something that made Clara's heart stop beating. The cowboy released the bridle and launched himself from his horse directly onto the back of the lead carriage horse. For a terrifying moment, he seemed to hang in the air, arms windmilling as he fought to land safely on the animal's back. Then he was there, clinging to the horse's neck, using his own weight and strength to force the panicked animal to slow its pace. It was the most courageous thing Clara had ever seen in her life. The horses began to respond, their pace dropping from a dead run to a canter, then to a trot. The cowboy slid down from the lead horse's back and grabbed both animals' bridles, using his voice and his presence to calm them further. Within another minute, the carriage had come to a complete stop in the middle of the town square, its passengers shaken but alive. The crowd that had scattered moments before now rushed forward to help, but Clara barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed on the cowboy as he checked on the woman and children in the carriage, his hands gentle as he helped them down from the vehicle, his voice too low for her to hear, but clearly reassuring from the way the children's crying began to subside. He had risked his own life without hesitation to save people he didn't even know. While she stood in a church surrounded by the supposed pillars of the community, this stranger had been the only one with enough courage and skill to actually help when help was needed most. "Well, that's settled then," Theodore said briskly, turning away from the window. "Clara, if you're quite finished with this entertainment, perhaps we can return to our wedding." Entertainment. He had called a near tragedy that could have killed 3 people entertainment. Clara felt something break loose inside her chest, something that had been straining against invisible bonds for months. The cowboy outside had just shown her what real courage looked like, what it meant to act on principle rather than convenience. He had seen people in danger and hadn't hesitated, hadn't calculated the cost to himself, hadn't worried about what others might think. He had simply done what was right. "No," Clara said quietly. Theodore's head snapped around. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Clara's voice grew stronger, carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "I won't be returning to our wedding because there isn't going to be a wedding." A collective gasp went up from the assembled guests, and her father stepped forward, his face pale with shock and something that might have been fear. "Clara, sweetheart, you're upset by what you've just witnessed," he said carefully. "But you can't let a moment of excitement cloud your judgment about something as important as marriage." "My judgment isn't clouded, Papa. It's finally clear." Clara turned to face Theodore, seeing him fully for what he was, a man who would watch the world burn if it meant protecting his own comfort. "I can't marry someone who sees other people's suffering as an inconvenience. I can't promise to love and honor a man who would rather maintain his schedule than save children's lives." Theodore's face flushed dark red, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're being hysterical. One moment of frontier dramatics doesn't change anything about our arrangement or your obligations." "You're right about one thing," Clara said, lifting her chin. "One moment can't change an arrangement, but it can certainly illuminate what that arrangement really is." She began walking toward the church doors, her silk skirts rustling with each step. Behind her, she could hear Theodore's angry voice demanding that she return immediately, her father's pleading tone urging her to reconsider, and the excited murmur of 300 wedding guests who had just witnessed the most scandalous event in Millbrook's recent history. Clara didn't care about any of it. For the first time in months, she was moving towards something instead of away from it, choosing her own path instead of accepting one chosen for her. The weight of expectations, social pressure and family obligation fell away from her shoulders like a cloak she no longer needed to wear. "Clara, stop!" Charles Whitmore's voice boomed through the sanctuary, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "If you walk out of this church, the agreement between our families is void. Your father's debts become due immediately, and I will see this building closed before the week is out." Clara's steps faltered for just a moment. The threat was real, she knew. Charles Whitmore was not a man who made idle promises, and her father's face had gone ashen at the ultimatum. Everything they had worked for, everyone who depended on the church's help, would suffer if she continued toward those doors. But then she thought about the cowboy outside, still helping the shaken family, probably not even aware that his act of courage had just changed the course of her entire life. He had faced a choice between safety and danger, between self-preservation and doing what was right, and he hadn't hesitated for even a second. Neither would she. "Then I guess you'll have to close it," Clara said without turning around, "because I would rather see this building torn down than see it saved by a marriage built on coercion and threats." She reached the church doors and pushed them open, stepping out into the bright Texas sunshine and the chaos of the town square. Behind her, the sanctuary erupted in excited voices, shocked exclamations, and Theodore's furious demands that someone stop her immediately. Clara lifted her heavy skirts and began to run. She ran past the crowd gathered around the stopped carriage, past the concerned neighbors checking on the rescued family, past the scattered debris from the runaway horses. Wild ride through the square. Her silk slippers weren't made for running, and her elaborate dress caught on every bush and fence post, but she didn't slow down. She had spent too many months walking carefully, measuring every step, considering every consequence. Now she wanted to run as fast and as far as her legs would carry her, away from the suffocating expectations that had nearly buried her alive. Behind her, she could hear pursuit. Theodore's voice shouting her name, her father calling for her to wait, the sound of footsteps on cobblestones as various wedding guests tried to follow. But Clara had a head start and a desperate need for freedom that gave wings to her feet. She rounded the corner past Miller's Creek, her chest burning with the effort of running in a corset, and finally allowed herself to slow to a walk. Here, away from the main square, the world was quiet except for the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks and the distant voices of her pursuers who seemed to be heading in the wrong direction. Clara leaned against an oak tree, fighting to catch her breath, and tried to process what she had just done. In the space of 10 minutes, she had destroyed her engagement, ruined her father's carefully laid plans, probably ensured the closure of their church, and made herself the subject of gossip that would follow her for the rest of her life. She should have felt devastated, terrified, ashamed of her impulsive decision to throw away security and respectability for a moment of principle. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in months. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up, expecting to see Theodore or one of his groomsmen coming to drag her back to the church. Instead, she found herself looking at the cowboy who had stopped the runaway carriage, sitting easily in his saddle and studying her with curious brown eyes. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "you seem to be in some distress. Would there anything I can do to help?" Clara stared at him, taking in the genuine concern in his expression, the gentle way he held his reins, the patient stillness with which he waited for her answer. This was the man who had risked his life for strangers, who had acted without hesitation when action was needed most. And he was offering to help her, a woman he'd never met, who was clearly running away from something in a wedding dress that probably cost more than he made in 6 months. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "I'm not sure anyone can help with what I've just done." The cowboy's mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. "Well, ma'am, in my experience, the things worth doing are usually the things that seem impossible to fix afterward. Sometimes that's how you know they were the right things to do." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the relief of being understood by a complete stranger in a way that the people who had known her all her life seemed unable to manage. "I just walked out on my own wedding," she said. "I figured as much from the dress," the cowboy replied mildly. "Question is, did you walk out on the right man or the wrong one?" "Definitely the wrong one." "Then it sounds like you made the right choice." He dismounted and stood beside his horse, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly prepared to stay as long as she needed him to. "I'm Luke Harrison, by the way. I work at Double Creek Ranch, about 5 miles outside of town." "Clara Bennett." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the church. "Daughter of Reverend Samuel Bennett, and apparently the talk of Millbrook for the foreseeable future. Pleased to meet you, Miss Bennett. And if it helps any, I suspect folks will have plenty of other things to talk about soon enough. They always do." Clara found herself smiling for the first time all day. "You're very kind, Mr. Harrison, and what you did back there, stopping those horses. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Luke shrugged, looking embarrassed by the praise. "Just did what needed doing. Couldn't stand by and watch folks get hurt when I might be able to help." "Most people would have stood by and watched." "Most people did stand by and watch. Well, I'm not most people, I suppose." Luke's eyes met hers, and Clara felt something spark between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. "Neither are you, I'm thinking, or you wouldn't have run out of that church." "I'm not sure what I am anymore," Clara admitted. "An hour ago I thought I knew exactly what my life was going to look like. Now I don't even know where I'm going to sleep tonight." "That's a problem we can solve," Luke said practically. "Nancy Porter runs a boarding house for respectable ladies. She's good people, and she doesn't ask too many questions. I could take you there if you'd like." Clara hesitated. Accepting help from a strange man, even one who had just performed an act of heroism, would only add to the scandal she had already created. But the alternative was returning to her father's house, where Theodore and Charles Whitmore were probably waiting with ultimatums and demands. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me or what I've done." Luke was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I suppose because I know what it's like to make a choice that changes everything, even when you're not sure it's the right choice. Sometimes a person needs a little help while they figure out what comes next." There was something in his voice, a note of understanding that spoke of personal experience with difficult decisions and uncertain futures. Clara found herself wanting to know more about this quiet cowboy who stopped runaway carriages and offered help to desperate strangers without expecting anything in return. "All right," she said finally. "I accept your offer, Mr. Harrison. And no, thank you." "No thanks necessary, Miss Bennett. Sometimes helping folks is just the right thing to do." As Luke helped her up onto his horse, Clara caught sight of her reflection in the creek. Her elaborate wedding hairstyle had come undone. During her run, her silk dress was torn and stained, and her face was flushed with exertion and emotion. She looked nothing like the perfect preacher's daughter who had walked into St. Matthew's Methodist Church that morning. She looked like herself again, and for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The ride to Nancy Porter's boarding house passed in comfortable silence, with Clara seated sideways behind Luke on his sturdy bay gelding. She had never ridden double with a man before, and the impropriety of it would have scandalized her just hours earlier. Now, with her arms loosely circling Luke's waist for balance and her ruined wedding dress billowing around them both, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Nancy Porter's establishment sat on a quiet street lined with elm trees, as a 2-story house painted yellow with white trim and a wraparound porch that invited visitors to sit and watch the world go by. It was exactly the sort of place where a woman could disappear for a while, gather her thoughts, and decide what to do with the rest of her life. Nancy herself appeared on the porch before they had even dismounted, a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She took in Clara's wedding dress, Luke's protective posture, and the general air of crisis surrounding them both. then simply nodded as if runaway brides arrived at her door every Sunday afternoon. "Clara Bennett," she said, not making it a question. "I heard the church bells stop ringing, and then I heard the commotion in the square. Should have known you'd be at the center of both." "Hello, Mrs. Porter," Clara said, suddenly feeling like a child caught in mischief. "I hope you won't think too poorly of me for what happened today." "Child, I've been thinking highly of you since you were old enough to walk. Nothing you did today is going to change that." Nancy's eyes shifted to Luke, and her expression softened with what looked like approval. "Luke Harrison, isn't it? From the Double Creek Ranch." "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping you might have a room available for Miss Bennett. She finds herself in need of a place to stay." "I expect she does." Nancy's tone was dry but not unkind. "Well, come inside, both of you. Clara, you look like you could use a cup of tea and a chance to get out of that dress. Luke, I suspect you could use some coffee and a slice of pie while we get things sorted." The interior of the boarding house was as welcoming as its exterior, with polished wood floors, comfortable furniture, and the lingering scent of fresh bread and coffee. Nancy led them to a sitting room decorated with quilts and family photographs, then disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Clara and Luke alone for the first time since their meeting by the creek. "She seems kind," Clara said, settling carefully into a chair upholstered in faded blue fabric. "Nancy Porter is one of the finest women in Texas," Luke agreed, taking a seat across from her. "She's helped more folks get back on their feet than anyone else I know. If she says she thinks highly of you, that's worth more than a dozen character references from anyone else." Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. For the first time since she had walked out of the church, she was beginning to believe that she might actually survive the consequences of her decision. "Mr. Harrison," she began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question that had been growing in her mind during their ride. "May I ask you something personal? Seems like we're past standing on ceremony, given the circumstances. And you can call me Luke. Luke, then. When you helped that family today, you didn't hesitate at all. You just acted. Have you always been that way, or is it something you learned?" Luke was quiet for a moment, his brown eyes thoughtful. "I suppose it's something I learned, though not in any way I'd recommend. Sometimes life puts you in situations where hesitation can cost more than action, even when the action might cost you everything." There was pain in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Clara found herself leaning forward, drawn by the sense that this quiet cowboy carried his own share of difficult choices and their consequences. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "We all have experiences that shape us, Miss Clara. Some are just more obvious than others." Before Clara could respond, Nancy returned with a tea service and the promised coffee and pie. She served them with the efficient grace of a woman who had been caring for others her entire life, then settled into her own chair with a cup of tea and a direct look that suggested it was time for honest conversation. "Now then," she said, "I suppose you'd better tell me what happened at that church today, Clara. The whole town's buzzing with different versions of the story, and I'd like to hear the truth from you." Clara found herself telling the entire story, from the financial pressures that had led to her engagement through her father's impossible situation to her moment of decision at the church window. Nancy listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "Charles Whitmore has your father over a barrel, then," she said when Clara finished. "That man's been trying to buy influence in this town for years, and I suppose he thought a preacher's daughter would be a good start." "The debts are real," Clara said quietly. "If Mr. Whitmore calls them in, the church will have to close. Papa's put everything he has into helping people, and now it's all going to fall apart because I couldn't go through with a marriage I never wanted. Child, you listen to me." Nancy's voice was firm but gentle. "Your father's debts are not your responsibility. And your marriage is not a business transaction. Any man who would use a young woman's sense of duty to force her into an unwanted union is not the sort of man who deserves to get what he wants. But the families who depend on the church will find other ways to get help, just like they did before your father arrived in Millbrook 20 years ago. People are resourceful when they have to be, and communities are stronger than any one building or institution. Luke had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Begging your pardon, ladies, but it seems to me that Charles Whitmore's hold over the church is based on him being the only source of money available to solve the problem. What if he wasn't the only option? Both women turned to look at him, and Clara felt her heart skip a beat at the possibility his words suggested. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Well, I don't know much about church finances, but I know something about community problems that need community solutions. At the ranch, when we need to fix something big like a barn or buy new equipment, we don't rely on one person to fund the whole thing. We pool resources, ask for help from neighboring ranches, sometimes even organize work parties where people contribute labor instead of money." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. "You're talking about fundraising, getting the whole community involved instead of depending on one wealthy family." "Something like that, though I suspect you'd know better than me how to organize such a thing." Nancy was nodding slowly, her expression brightening with interest. "It's not a bad idea, Clara. Your father has friends all over East Texas, other pastors who might be willing to help, families he's assisted over the years who would want to return the favor. It would take time and effort, but it's certainly possible." But even if we could raise the money," Clara said, "Mr. Whitmore has made it clear that he expects more than just debt repayment. He wants the social connection, the respectability that comes with having his family tied to the church leadership. He's not going to give up easily just because someone else pays the bills. Then we'll have to make sure the alternative to giving up is more unpleasant than backing down," Nancy said with a smile that reminded Clara why the woman had a reputation for getting things done despite any obstacles. "What do you mean?" "Charles Whitmore's business depends on his reputation in the community. If people start thinking of him as the sort of man who bullies preachers and forces young women into unwanted marriages, his customers might start taking their business elsewhere. Lumber mills need local support to thrive." Luke was grinning now, clearly enjoying the direction of the conversation. "And if word happened to spread to neighboring towns about his business practices, well, that could affect his reputation across a pretty wide area." Clara felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest, warm and bright and more precious than any wedding dress. "You're both talking about fighting back instead of just enduring, about refusing to let him use my father's conscience against him. That's exactly what we're talking about," Nancy confirmed. "But it won't be easy and it won't be quick. Are you prepared for that kind of battle?" Clara thought about the months she had spent feeling trapped, accepting a future she didn't. One, because it seemed like the only way to protect people she loved. She thought about her father's face as he walked her down the aisle, resigned to sacrificing his daughter's happiness for his calling. She thought about Theodore's dismissive attitude toward the crisis in the town square, his casual cruelty toward people whose lives meant nothing to him. Then she thought about Luke throwing himself onto the back of a panicked horse to save strangers, about Nancy offering shelter without question, about the possibility of finding a solution that didn't require anyone to compromise their principles or sacrifice their future. "I'm more than prepared," she said firmly. "I'm eager to start." "Well then," Nancy said, rising from her chair with the air of a general preparing for battle, "I suppose we'd better get you out of that wedding dress and into something more suitable for the work ahead. Luke, would you mind checking around town to see what the reaction has been to today's events? It would be helpful to know what we're dealing with." "I'd be happy to," Luke said, standing as well. "Miss Clara, I want you to know that whatever you decide to do going forward, you won't be facing it alone. Nancy's right about this community being stronger than any one person's threats." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you, Luke, both of you. A few hours ago I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it might just be beginning." "That's because it is beginning," Nancy said practically. "Now come along, dear. We have work to do." As Clara followed Nancy upstairs to select more appropriate clothing, she caught a glimpse of herself in a hallway mirror. Her hair was still disheveled, her face still flushed with emotion and exertion, but her eyes held something they hadn't, contained in months: hope. Behind her, she could hear Luke preparing to leave, his boots quiet on the wooden floors, his voice low as he spoke with Nancy about the best places to gather information about the town's reaction to the morning's events. He was already working on her behalf. This man she had met only hours ago, committed to helping her find a solution to problems that weren't his responsibility. Clara paused at the top of the stairs, looking back down at Luke as he prepared to mount his horse. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "See you soon, Miss Clara," he called softly. "See you soon, Luke," she replied, and meant it with every fibre of her being. For the first time since her engagement had been announced, Clara Bennett was looking forward to tomorrow. 3 days had passed since Clara's dramatic exit from St. Matthew's Methodist Church, and Millbrook was still buzzing with speculation, gossip, and increasingly divided opinions about what the preacher's daughter had done. Nancy Porter's boarding house had become an unofficial headquarters for what the townspeople were beginning to call either Clara's rebellion or the Bennett family's disgrace, depending on which side of the controversy they favored. Clara herself had thrown herself into the work of organizing a community response to her father's financial crisis with the determination of a woman who finally had a purpose that aligned with her principles. She had shed her silk wedding dress for a practical blue calico that belonged to one of Nancy's other boarders, pinned her auburn hair back in a simple style that stayed out of her way while she worked, and discovered that freedom from expectations was even more liberating than she had imagined. Luke had become a daily visitor, arriving each morning with information gathered from his rounds through town and the surrounding ranches. His quiet presence had become as essential to Clara's sense of stability as Nancy's fierce support, and she found herself looking forward to his arrival with an anticipation that went far beyond mere gratitude for his help. On this particular morning, however, Luke's expression was more serious than usual as he settled into his customary chair in Nancy's sitting room with a cup of coffee and news that was clearly troubling. "Charles Whitmore has been busy," he said, without preamble. "He's called in 2 more debts this week, both from families who spoke publicly about supporting your father. The Henderson family lost their small farm yesterday, and Jim Murphy was let go from his job at the lumber mill." Clara's stomach clenched with guilt and anger. "He's punishing people for being loyal to Papa. That's unconscionable." "It's effective," Nancy said grimly. "Word is spreading that anyone who helps the Bennett family or opposes the church closure will face consequences. Some folks are getting scared." "How many people have withdrawn their support?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "About half," Luke admitted. "The ones who can't afford to make Charles Whitmore an enemy. I can't blame them for that, but it does make our job harder." Clara sank into her chair, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over her like a lead blanket. Every day that passed brought new evidence of how her decision was affecting innocent people, and she was beginning to wonder if her moment of courage at the church had been selfish rather than principled. "Maybe I should reconsider," she said, quietly. Maybe I should go to Theodore and tell him I made a mistake, that I'm ready to honor the original agreement. The silence that followed her words was heavy with disappointment and concern. Nancy and Luke exchanged a look that suggested they had been expecting this moment of doubt, but that didn't make it any easier to witness. "Clara," Nancy said gently, "what would that solve? You'd be married to a man you can't respect. Your father would still be under Charles Whitmore's thumb, and the community would learn that standing up to bullies only brings worse consequences. But people are suffering because of my choice. The Hendersons, the Murphys, who knows how many others. How can I live with that?" Luke leaned forward, his brown eyes serious and intent. "Miss Clara, can I tell you something about the worst choice I ever made?" Clara nodded, recognizing that he was about to share something personal and painful. 2 years ago, I was working for a ranch up north of here, and the owner was treating his workers badly. Long hours, dangerous conditions, pay that barely covered food and shelter. A few of us tried to organize the other hands, push for better treatment. The owner found out and gave us an ultimatum: back down and keep our jobs, or keep pushing and get fired with no references. Luke paused, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. I backed down, told myself I was being practical, that losing my job wouldn't help anyone. Within 6 months, 3 men had been seriously injured because of the unsafe working conditions, and one of them died. I've wondered every day since then what might have been different if I'd had the courage to keep fighting instead of choosing the safe path. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the pain in his voice. "Luke, you can't blame yourself for another man's death." "Maybe not entirely, but I can take responsibility for not doing everything I could to prevent it. That's why I left that ranch and came here. That's why I stopped those horses in the town square without thinking about the risk, and that's why I'm asking you not to make the same mistake I did." "This is different," Clara protested. "This is about more than just my principles. This is about people's livelihoods, their ability to feed their families. And what happens to those families when Charles Whitmore decides he wants something else from this community? When he finds another way to use people's dependence against them? You think he's going to stop with controlling the church and your marriage?" Nancy nodded emphatically. "Luke's right, dear. Men like Charles Whitmore don't stop when they get what they want. They just want more. If you give in now, you're not solving the problem. You're just postponing it and making it worse." Clara stared out the window at the quiet street, watching a neighbor woman hang laundry on her line while her children played in the yard. It was such a peaceful, ordinary scene, but she knew that behind the normalcy, families were struggling with impossible choices between loyalty and survival. "So, what do we do?" she asked finally. "Half our supporters have withdrawn. Charles Whitmore is systematically punishing anyone who opposes him, and we're no closer to raising enough money to pay off the church debts than we were 3 days ago." "We change tactics," Luke said firmly. "Instead of just trying to raise money to pay off Whitmore, we work on making sure he can't keep using debt as a weapon against people." "How do we do that?" Luke's expression grew determined, the kind of look Clara was beginning to recognize as his planning face. "We expose what he's doing to a wider audience. Charles Whitmore's power comes from operating in a small pond where he can control the narrative. But Texas is a big state, and there are plenty of people who don't like seeing bullies use debt and intimidation to control communities." "You're talking about going to the newspapers," Nancy said, catching on immediately. "Getting the story out beyond Millbrook." "Exactly, and not just newspapers. There are church organizations, business associations, even political groups that would be interested in hearing about a wealthy man using financial pressure to force a preacher's daughter into marriage. That kind of story has a way of spreading, especially when it involves corruption and abuse of power." Clara felt a flutter of both hope and nervousness. But that would mean making our private business public across the entire state. Everyone would know about Papa's debts, about my broken engagement, about everything. They're going to know anyway, Luke pointed out gently. The question is whether they hear Whitmore's version or yours. Right now, he controls the story, because he controls who gets to tell it. But if we take it to a wider audience, he loses that control. Nancy was already moving toward her writing desk, her movements quick and purposeful. I have contacts at newspapers in Dallas, Austin, and Houston, women I've corresponded with over the years about various causes. They'd be very interested in a story about a man using debt to essentially purchase a bride. And I know ranchers and cattlemen throughout East Texas, Luke added. Men who do business with lumber mills and wouldn't appreciate hearing that one of their suppliers uses intimidation tactics against churches and families. Clara stood and began pacing, her mind racing through the implications of what they were proposing. It was bold, risky, and would certainly make Charles Whitmore furious. It was also the first plan they had discussed that might actually work. If we do this, there's no going back, she said. Charles Whitmore will see it as a declaration of war. Good, Nancy said tartly, already pulling out writing paper. It's about time someone declared war on him. Clara, Luke said, standing as well, I want you to understand something. If we go down this path, it's going to get harder before it gets easier. Whitmore has resources and connections we don't have. He's going to fight back, and it won't be pretty. What kind of fighting back? Legal challenges, business pressure, maybe even personal attacks on your character and your father's reputation. He'll try to make the cost of opposing him so high that you'll have no choice but to surrender. Clara thought about Theodore's dismissive attitude toward the emergency in the town square, about Charles Whitmore's casual threats against her father, about the families already suffering because they had dared to show loyalty to the Bennett family. The idea of months or even years of escalating conflict was daunting, but the alternative was a lifetime of knowing she had surrendered to a bully when she could have fought back. "Will you help me?" she asked, looking between Luke and Nancy. "I mean, really help me, even when it gets difficult and dangerous?" "Child," Nancy said, setting down her pen to look directly at Clara, "I've been waiting my entire life for a fight worth having. This is it." Luke's answer was quieter but no less firm. "I told you before that I made the wrong choice once. When I had the chance to stand up to a powerful man, I won't make that mistake again." Clara felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced since her father had first told her about the engagement. This was what courage felt like, she realized, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. "Then let's do it," she said. "Let's tell our story." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Nancy drafted letters to her, newspaper contacts, while Luke made a list of ranchers and businessmen who might be willing to spread the word about Charles Whitmore's tactics. Clara found herself in the unfamiliar but exhilarating position of being the author of her own story rather than a passive character in someone else's narrative. As afternoon faded into evening, a knock at the front door interrupted their planning session. Nancy went to answer it, and Clara could hear voices in the hallway, too low to make out words but urgent in tone. When Nancy returned to the sitting room, her expression was grim. "That was young Tommy Henderson," she said. "His father sent him to warn us. Charles Whitmore has called a town meeting for tomorrow night. He's telling people it's time to discuss the future of St. Matthew's Church and what needs to be done about the Bennett family's destructive influence on the community." Clara's stomach dropped. "He's going to try to turn the whole town against us publicly." "Most likely," Luke agreed, "and he'll probably use the meeting to make new threats against anyone who's been supporting you." It's a smart move, actually. Force a public confrontation when he thinks he has the advantage. So what do? We can't possibly counter whatever story he's planning to tell. He has weeks of preparation, and we have 1 day. Nancy's eyes were bright with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. We don't counter his story, dear. We tell ours first. What do you mean? I mean, we call our own meeting for tomorrow afternoon, before his evening gathering. We invite everyone in town to hear your side of events, and we make sure our version of the truth gets out before his lies have a chance to take root. Luke was nodding slowly. It's risky. If it goes badly, we'll have lost our chance to control the narrative, but if it goes well, we turn his ambush into our opportunity, Clara finished, understanding the strategy. But what would I even say? How do you convince an entire town to support you against the wealthiest, most powerful man in the county? You tell them the truth, Nancy said simply. You tell them what really happened at that church, why you made the choice you did, and what Charles Whitmore has been doing to people who disagree with him. Most importantly, you give them a vision of what Millbrook could be like if people stood together instead of being picked off one by one. I've never spoken publicly before, Clara admitted. What if I freeze up? What if I say the wrong thing? Luke moved closer, his presence steady and reassuring. Miss Clara, you had the courage to walk out of your own wedding in front of 300 people when you saw something that violated your principles. I think you can handle talking to those same people about why you did it. Besides, Nancy added with a wry smile, what's the worst that could happen? They could decide. They don't support you? Half of them have already made that decision. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. Clara looked between these two people who had become her closest allies, seeing the confidence in their faces even when she couldn't find it in herself. They believed she could do this impossible thing, and their faith was beginning to kindle something similar in her own heart. All right, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Let's call a meeting. Let's tell the truth and see what happens. Now you're talking, Nancy said, already reaching for her shawl. I'll go start spreading the word. Luke, can you handle getting the church opened for tomorrow afternoon? I'll talk to Reverend Bennett first thing in the morning, Luke promised. I suspect he'll be more than willing to let his daughter use his pulpit to defend their family's honor. As Nancy bustled out to begin organizing what was essentially a grassroots political campaign with less than 24 hours' notice, Clara found herself alone with Luke for the first time since their initial meeting by Miller's Creek. The sitting room felt different without Nancy's energetic presence, quieter and more intimate. Luke, Clara said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always am with you, Miss Clara. Why are you doing this, really? I know what you said about making the right choice this time, but this isn't your fight. You barely know me, and you have no obligation to get involved in Millbrook's problems. You could lose your job, your reputation, maybe even your safety if Charles Whitmore decides to target you directly. Luke was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes thoughtful as he considered her question. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. The honest answer is that it stopped being about doing the right thing somewhere between watching you run away from that church and seeing you organize a community response to injustice. This became personal for me, Clara, in ways I didn't expect and probably shouldn't admit. Clara's heart began beating faster. Personal how? Personal in the way that means I care more about your happiness and your future than I do about my own safety. Personal in the way that means I've been thinking about you every moment I'm not with you, wondering what you're thinking, hoping you're all right. Personal in the way that means I'd rather stand beside you in a fight we might lose than be anywhere else in the world. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his admission, took Clara's breath away. She had suspected that something was growing between them. some connection that went deeper than circumstance and mutual respect. But hearing him voice it made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "Luke," she began, then stopped, unsure how to respond to such an honest declaration when her own feelings were still sorting themselves out. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know this isn't the time or place for such conversations, and I know you've got more important things to worry about than whatever's happening between us. I just wanted you to know that my reasons for helping you aren't entirely noble. Some of them are purely selfish." Clara stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the scent of leather and sunshine that seemed to cling to his clothes. "What if I told you that my reasons for accepting your help aren't entirely practical either?" she said softly. "What if I told you that somewhere between watching you risk your life for strangers and seeing you commit to fighting injustice alongside me, this became personal for me too?" Luke's expression shifted, hope and something deeper flickering across his features. "Then I'd say we have something worth exploring once we get through tomorrow's challenges. Is that a promise, Mr. Harrison?" "It's a promise, Miss Bennett." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, a different kind of courage than what she would need for tomorrow's meeting, but no less important. For months, she had felt like her future was being decided by other people, shaped by forces beyond her control. Now standing in Nancy Porter's sitting room with Luke Harrison's steady gaze holding hers, she was beginning to understand that the future was something she could choose for herself. Tomorrow, she would stand before her community and ask them to choose courage over compliance, principle over convenience. But tonight, in the quiet space between one day and the next, she was choosing hope over fear, trust over suspicion, and the possibility of love over the safety of solitude. It felt like the most natural decision she had ever made. "We should get some rest," Luke said, though he made no move to leave. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Yes, it is," Clara agreed, also staying exactly where she was. "Luke." "Yes, and thank you for everything, but especially for helping me remember who I am when I was starting to forget." "Clara, you never forgot who you were. You just needed someone to remind you that who you are is worth fighting for." Udidi, as Luke finally prepared to leave, Clara felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with nervousness about the next day's challenges. Whatever happened at tomorrow's meeting, whatever Charles Whitmore's response might be, she would face it as herself rather than as someone else's idea of who she should be, and she wouldn't be facing it alone. For the first time since her engagement had been announced, Clara Bennett was looking forward to the future with genuine excitement, rather than resigned acceptance. Tomorrow, she would find out whether her community was ready to stand with her against injustice. Tonight, she was content to know that at least two people already had. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of St. Matthew's Methodist Church, casting geometric patterns of light and shadow across the wooden pews that were slowly filling with curious, concerned, and occasionally hostile faces. Clara stood at the side door, leading from her father's office to the sanctuary, watching the congregation gather and trying to calm the butterflies that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in her stomach. Word of her meeting had spread quickly through Millbrook, just as Nancy had predicted it would. What surprised Clara was the diversity of people who had chosen to attend. She saw familiar faces from years of Sunday services, but also noticed ranch hands she barely knew, women from the other side of town who rarely attended church functions, and even a few businessmen who usually avoided anything that might be construed as taking sides in local controversies. "Quite a turnout," her father said quietly, appearing beside her with an expression that mixed pride, worry, and something that looked like hope. "I haven't seen the church this full since Christmas service." "Are you sure about this, Papa?" Clara asked, suddenly seized with doubt about the wisdom of using her father's pulpit for what was essentially a political speech. "I don't want to damage your reputation any further than I already have." Reverend Samuel Bennett straightened to his full height, and for a moment Clara saw the man who had spent 20 years fearlessly addressing moral issues from this same pulpit, regardless of who might be offended by his message. "Clara, my reputation was built on speaking truth and standing up for what's right. If I'm not willing to let my own daughter do the same thing from this pulpit, then I've lost sight of everything I've tried to teach this community about faith and courage, even if it costs you the church. Especially if it costs me the church. Buildings are just wood and stone, sweetheart. The church is the people, and today you're going to remind them what they're capable of when they stand together." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the confidence in her father's voice. For months she had watched him struggle with impossible choices, seen him bend under the weight of obligations that threatened to crush everything he held dear. Now, in this moment before what might be their last stand, he looked like the man she remembered from her childhood, strong, principled, and unafraid to fight for what he believed in. "Miss Clara." Luke appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and his expression serious but encouraging. "Nancy says it's time." Clara nodded, taking a deep breath and smoothing her simple blue dress. She had chosen her clothing carefully, wanting to look respectable but not ostentatious, approachable but not casual. The dress was one Nancy had loaned her, well made but practical, the kind of thing a working woman might wear to church on Sunday. "How do I look?" she asked, suddenly feeling like a nervous child rather than a woman about to address her entire community. "Like someone worth listening to," Luke said simply, and the quiet confidence in his voice steadied her more than any elaborate compliment could have. Clara walked into the sanctuary with her father and Luke flanking her, their presence a reminder that she wasn't facing this challenge alone. The murmur of conversation gradually died away as people noticed her entrance, and by the time she reached the pulpit, the church was silent except for the rustle of clothing and the creak of old wooden pews. Looking out over the assembled faces, Clara felt a moment of pure terror. These were people who had known her since childhood, who had watched her grow up in this church, who had opinions about her behavior that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of what she said today. Among them, she spotted Charles Whitmore himself, sitting in the back with Theodore and several other well-dressed men she didn't recognize. His presence was clearly intended to intimidate, and Clara had to admit it was working. Then her gaze found Nancy Porter, sitting in the third row with an expression of fierce encouragement, and Luke standing along the side wall where he could see both Clara and the entire congregation. Their faith in her was a lifeline she grabbed onto with both hands. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I know many of you have questions about what happened at my wedding last Sunday, and I appreciate the opportunity to answer them honestly." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "I suppose I should start by explaining why I chose to leave the altar rather than marry Theodore Whitmore. The simple answer is that I realized I couldn't promise to love and honor a man who would dismiss other people's suffering as an inconvenience." A murmur ran through the congregation. Some approving, others disapproving. Clara pressed on, but the complete answer is more complicated than that. It involves financial pressures that my father and I never discussed publicly, threats that were made against our family and our church, and the difference between choosing a marriage partner and being sold to the highest bidder. The murmur grew louder, and Clara could see shock and anger on some faces, skepticism on others. Charles Whitmore's expression remained carefully neutral, but she noticed his hands clenched into fists on his knees. 3 months ago, Charles Whitmore approached my father with an offer that seemed generous on the surface. His son would marry me, and in return, the Whitmore family would make substantial donations to the church and ensure our family's financial security. What Mr. Whitmore didn't mention was that he had already purchased the church's debts from the bank, giving him the power to foreclose on this building and destroy my father's ministry if we refused his offer. Gasps and exclamations erupted throughout the church. Several people turned to stare at Charles Whitmore, who had gone pale but remained seated. "That's a lie!" Theodore's voice cut through the noise as he stood up in the back of the church. "My father made a generous offer to help a struggling church, and this ungrateful woman is twisting it into something sinister because she's embarrassed about her own behavior." "Is it a lie?" Clara asked, her voice remaining calm despite the anger she could feel radiating from the Whitmore family. Then perhaps Mr. Whitmore would be willing to explain why the Henderson family lost their farm this week after speaking publicly in support of my father, or why Jim Murphy was fired from the lumber mill for the same reason. More gasps, and now Clara could see real anger on faces throughout the congregation. These were people who knew and cared about the Henderson and Murphy families, who understood the devastating impact of losing a farm or a job in a community like Millbrook. Furthermore, Clara continued, perhaps the Whitmore family would be willing to explain why they consider a marriage arrangement made under threat of financial ruin to be generous rather than coercive. Charles Whitmore finally stood, his face flushed with anger. "Young woman, you are making serious accusations without any proof. I have conducted all my business dealings in Millbrook according to standard practices, and I will not sit here and allow you to slander my family's reputation." "Then let's talk about standard practices," Clara said, feeling her confidence grow as she watched the congregation's reaction to Whitmore's words. "Is it standard practice to use debt as a weapon against families who disagree with you? Is it standard practice to demand marriage as payment for financial assistance? Is it standard practice to threaten the closure of churches and the destruction of livelihoods when you don't get what you want?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Clara could see people throughout the congregation exchanging glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking troubled and uncertain. "The truth is," Clara said, her voice softening, "that my father found himself in an impossible situation. He had borrowed money to help families in need, to repair flood damage, to provide food and medicine for people who had nowhere else to turn. When those debts came due and he couldn't pay them, Mr. Whitmore offered what seemed like the only solution available." She looked directly at her father, seeing the pain and pride warring in his expression. "Papa, you were willing to sacrifice your daughter's happiness to save your ministry and protect the people who depend on this church. That's the act of a man who takes his calling seriously, and I honor you for it. But I couldn't be part of a solution that required me to marry a man who sees other people's lives as inconsequential compared to his own convenience." Clara turned back to the congregation, seeing faces she had known since childhood. People who had watched her grow up and who would live with the consequences of whatever decision was made here today. "I left that altar because I believe this community is capable of better solutions than trading daughters for debt forgiveness. I believe we can find ways to help each other that don't require anyone to compromise their principles or sacrifice their future. I believe Millbrook is strong enough to solve its own problems without surrendering control to anyone who thinks money gives them the right to control other people's lives." The church was completely silent now, every person focused intently on Clara's words. "But I need your help to prove that I'm right. We can work together to address the church's financial problems through community fundraising, volunteer labor, and mutual support. We can show other towns and other powerful men that Millbrook won't be bought or intimidated. We can build something here that's based on cooperation rather than coercion." Clara paused, looking around the sanctuary one more time before making her final appeal. "Or we can accept that money trumps morality, that power matters more than principle, and that young women are commodities to be traded rather than human beings with the right to choose their own futures. The choice is yours, and whatever you decide will determine not just my fate, but the kind of community Millbrook becomes." She stepped back from the pulpit, her heart pounding, and waited for the response. For a long moment, the silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of decision. Then, slowly, Nancy Porter stood up in the third row. "I've lived in this town for 30 years, Nancy said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I've seen good people struggle and bad people prosper, and I've watched too many folks accept injustice because they were afraid to fight it. Today, Clara Bennett showed us what courage looks like. I, for one, am ready to stand with her." As Nancy sat down, another figure rose from the middle of the church. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman whose family had just lost their farm to Charles Whitmore's retribution. "My husband worked that land for 40 years, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We lost it because we had the audacity to speak well of Reverend Bennett and his daughter. If that's not proof of what Mr. Whitmore is capable of, I don't know what is. Clara's right about him, and she's right about us. We're better than this." One by one, people throughout the congregation began to stand. Jim Murphy, despite losing his job at the lumber mill. Young Tommy Henderson, whose family had been destroyed by Whitmore's vindictiveness. Ranch hands and shopkeepers, mothers and grandmothers, people who had spent their lives watching from the sidelines, finally deciding to step forward. Soon, more than half the congregation was on their feet, their faces set with determination. Charles Whitmore looked around the sanctuary with growing alarm, clearly realizing that his control over the community was slipping away. "This is ridiculous," Theodore declared, his voice sharp with panic. "You're all being manipulated by a hysterical woman who's embarrassed about her own poor judgment. None of you have the resources to solve this church's problems, and you'll regret this emotional decision when reality sets in." "Maybe," said a voice from the back of the church. Everyone turned to see Luke Harrison stepping forward, his hat still in his hands, but his expression confident. "But I'd rather regret trying to do the right thing than regret surrendering to a bully without a fight." Luke looked directly at Clara, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Besides," he continued, "some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Some people are worth fighting for regardless of the cost." Clara felt tears of gratitude and something deeper than gratitude spilling down her cheeks. Around her, she could see the faces of her community, people who had chosen to stand with her despite the risks, despite the uncertainty, despite Charles Whitmore's threats and Theodore's dismissal. "Very well," Charles Whitmore said, his voice cold with fury. "You've made your choice, but don't come crying to me when this romantic nonsense collapses and you're left with nothing but debt and regret. The church foreclosure will proceed as scheduled, and anyone who has supported this rebellion will find that there are consequences for making an enemy of the Whitmore family." As Charles and Theodore stalked out of the church, followed by their supporters, Clara felt a mixture of triumph and terror. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. "What happens now?" someone called out from the congregation. Clara looked around the sanctuary, seeing determined faces and uncertain ones, people who had committed to a fight they weren't sure they could win. "Now we get to work," she said. "We organize fundraising efforts. We reach out to other communities. For support, we show Charles Whitmore and anyone else who might be watching that Millbrook doesn't surrender to intimidation." "And if we fail?" another voice asked. Clara thought about the question seriously before answering. If we fail, at least we'll fail on our own terms, fighting for what we believe in. That's more than we would have if we surrendered without trying. As the congregation began to disperse, people stopping to offer their support and ask how they could help, Clara found herself surrounded by the warmth of community in a way she had never experienced before. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were allies, partners in creating the kind of future they wanted for themselves and their children. "Miss Clara?" Luke appeared beside her as the crowd began to thin. "Might I have a word with you privately?" Clara nodded, following him outside where the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. They walked to the small garden behind the church, where her mother had planted roses years before her death, and stood among the fragrant blooms in comfortable silence. "That was brave," Luke said finally. "What you did in there, the way you spoke to them, the way you gave them hope and a vision of something better, that was the most courageous thing I've ever seen." "I was terrified the entire time," Clara admitted. "I kept thinking about all the ways it could go wrong, all the people who might suffer because of my choices. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, Clara. Not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." Clara turned to face him, seeing the admiration in his eyes and feeling her own heart respond to the warmth in his expression. "Luke, about what you said in the church about some people being worth fighting for." "I meant every word," he said quietly. "Clara, I know this isn't the ideal time for such conversations, and I know you have more important things to worry about than whatever's growing between us. But I need you to know that regardless of what happens with Charles Whitmore, regardless of whether we succeed or fail in saving the church, I want to be part of your future, if you'll have me." Clara felt her breath catch at the sincerity in his voice. "Are you proposing to me, Mr. Harrison?" "I suppose I am, Miss Bennett, though I realize it's presumptuous of me to ask when you've just escaped one unwanted engagement." "The difference," Clara said, stepping closer to him, "is that this time I'm being asked rather than told. This time it's my choice to make." "And what choice are you making?" Clara reached up to touch his face, marveling at how right it felt. To be close to him, how natural it seemed to imagine a future built on partnership rather than obligation. "I'm choosing you, Luke Harrison. I'm choosing a life built on mutual respect and shared values. I'm choosing love over convenience, principle over security, and hope over fear." Luke's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the roses bloomed around them, and the future stretched out ahead, uncertain but bright with possibility. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together," he said, and kissed her as the church bells began to ring, calling the community to evening prayers and to whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. 6 months later, Clara Bennett Harrison stood in the same garden behind St. Matthew's Methodist Church, wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of the roses her mother had planted years before. The church behind her was debt-free, saved by a community-wide fundraising effort that had drawn support from across East Texas and beyond. Charles Whitmore had eventually dropped his foreclosure threats when the negative publicity about his business practices began affecting his lumber sales throughout the region. Luke waited for her at the garden's entrance, handsome in his best suit and smiling with the joy of a man who had found everything he never dared hope for. Around them, the same community that had stood with her in that moment of crisis now gathered to celebrate her choice to marry for love rather than obligation. As they spoke their vows surrounded by friends and family, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a runaway carriage and a cowboy brave enough to risk everything for strangers. It had continued with a preacher's daughter who learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith is choosing your own path. And it had led to this, A love built on shared courage, mutual respect, and the understanding that the best partnerships are forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the willingness to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. As Luke kissed his bride under the Texas sky, the church bells rang out across Millbrook, calling the community to celebrate not just a wedding, but the triumph of principle over power, love over obligation, and hope over fear. It was, Clara thought as she looked into her husband's eyes, exactly the kind of future worth fighting for. Part 4. The Test. The morning of the town meeting dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds gathering on the horizon that seemed to mirror the tension building throughout Millbrook. Clara stood at the window of Nancy Porter's boarding house, watching early rising townspeople hurry about their business with the purposeful energy of folks who knew something significant was about to happen. Word had spread overnight that both Clara Bennett and Charles Whitmore would be addressing the community, and the anticipation was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Second thoughts?" Nancy asked, appearing beside Clara with 2 cups of coffee, and the kind of steady presence that had become Clara's anchor in the storm of recent events. "About a dozen of them," Clara admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But not about whether we're doing the right thing, only about whether I'm strong enough to see it through when things get difficult. Strength isn't something you either have or don't have, dear. It's something you build by doing hard things when you'd rather run away. You've been building yours for days now, and it shows." Clara turned from the window to study Nancy's face, seeing the confidence there and drawing courage from it. Over the past week, Nancy Porter had transformed from a kind landlady into something closer to a general preparing for battle, and her strategic mind had been invaluable in planning their approach to the community meeting. "Have you heard anything about what Charles Whitmore is planning to say tonight?" Clara asked. "Tommy Henderson brought word from his cousin who works at the lumber mill," Nancy replied, settling into her favorite chair with the air of someone sharing intelligence gathered from behind enemy lines. "Apparently, Mr. Whitmore has been meeting with several prominent businessmen from neighboring towns, and there's talk of bringing in outside pressure to resolve what he's calling Millbrook's disruption problem." Clara felt her stomach clench with worry. Outside pressure meaning what, exactly? Legal challenges to your father's right to remain in the church, most likely. Questions about his fitness to serve as pastor. Maybe even suggestions that the church board should be replaced with more responsible leadership. He's going to try to destroy Papa's reputation and his calling. Clara's voice was flat with the certainty of it. "Even if we manage to raise the money to pay off the debts, he'll find other ways to make our lives impossible." "Which is exactly why we can't just play defense," Nancy said firmly. "We have to make the cost of continuing his campaign higher than the cost of backing down. That means exposing not just what he's done here, but what he's capable of doing elsewhere if people don't stand up to him." A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation, followed by the sound of Luke's voice calling out a greeting. Clara felt her heart lift at his arrival, as it had every morning for the past week. His steady presence had become essential to her sense of stability, and she found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that went far beyond gratitude for his help. "Morning, ladies," Luke said as Nancy let him into the sitting room. "I've got news, and I'm not sure whether it's good or bad." "Let's have it," Clara said, bracing herself for whatever new complication had arisen. "I rode out to the Double Creek Ranch early this morning to check on some things, and I ran into a couple of federal marshals who were asking questions about Charles Whitmore's business practices. Seems someone filed a complaint about his debt collection methods, and they're looking into whether he's violated any federal laws regarding interstate commerce and intimidation." Clara and Nancy exchanged glances, both recognizing the potential significance of this development. "Did they say who filed the complaint?" Nancy asked, They wouldn't give names, but they mentioned that several business owners from different towns had come forward with similar stories about Whitmore using debt and threats to control local politics and force unwanted business arrangements. That could change everything, Clara said, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time in days. If he's facing federal investigation, he can't afford to be seen as continuing his intimidation campaign here. Maybe, Luke said, but his expression remained cautious. Or it could make him more desperate and dangerous. A man with federal marshals breathing down his neck might decide he has nothing to lose by escalating his tactics. Nancy was nodding, thoughtfully. Luke's right. This could go either way, but it does give us additional ammunition for this afternoon's meeting. People need to understand that Charles Whitmore's behavior isn't an isolated incident confined to Millbrook. It's part of a pattern that's attracted federal attention. Should we mention the investigation publicly? Clara asked. I don't want to say anything that might interfere with whatever the marshals are doing. We don't need to mention specifics, Luke suggested. But we can certainly talk about the importance of communities standing up to bullies before their behavior attracts the kind of attention that reflects badly on everyone involved. Clara was about to respond when another knock at the door sent Nancy hurrying to answer it. This time, the visitor was Clara's father, and his expression was grave as he entered the sitting room with his hat in his hands, and worry etched deeply in the lines around his eyes. "Papa, what's wrong?" Clara asked, immediately sensing that he brought troubling news. "I've just come from a meeting with the church board," Reverend Bennett said, sinking heavily into an empty chair. "Charles Whitmore requested the meeting, and he made some very serious accusations about my fitness to continue as pastor." "What kind of accusations?" Nancy demanded, her voice sharp with outrage. "He's claiming that my financial mismanagement has endangered the church's future, that I've allowed my personal feelings to override my pastoral judgment, and that I've been using my position to promote political division in the community." Samuel Bennett's voice was steady, but Clara could see the pain these charges caused him. "He's also suggesting that my inability to control my daughter's behavior reflects a lack of moral authority that makes me unsuitable for church leadership." Clara felt anger surge through her, hot and righteous. "He's blaming you for my choices. That's ridiculous. Every person in this town knows that you've spent 20 years serving this community with integrity and compassion. The board knows it too," her father said. "They voted to reject his demands for my immediate resignation. But he's made it clear that if I continue to support your opposition to his family, he'll find other ways to make serving this church impossible." "What other ways?" Luke asked. His voice, carrying the dangerous quiet that Clara was learning, indicated deep anger carefully controlled. "Legal challenges to my ordination credentials, pressure on the denominational headquarters to investigate allegations of misconduct, questions about the church's tax-exempt status based on claims that we're engaging in inappropriate political activities." Samuel Bennett looked older than Clara had ever seen him, worn down by the weight of threats that seemed to multiply with each passing day. "Papa, this is exactly what we expected," Clara said, moving to kneel beside his chair and take his hands in hers. "Charles Whitmore is trying to isolate us, make us feel like the fight is hopeless, so we'll surrender without forcing him to follow through on his threats. But we knew he would escalate his tactics when he realized we weren't going to back down easily." "I know, sweetheart. I do know that." But hearing those accusations, seeing the board members' faces as they tried to decide whether supporting me was worth the risk to their own families, it's harder than I expected. Nancy leaned forward, her expression fierce with determination. "Samuel, that man is counting on exactly this reaction. He wants you to feel overwhelmed and isolated, so you'll convince Clara to reconsider her position. Don't give him the satisfaction." "She's right, Reverend," Luke added. "I've seen men like Charles Whitmore before." They rely on fear and intimidation because they know their actual power is more limited than it appears. But they're also cowards at heart. When faced with real resistance, they usually find easier targets. The question is whether we can maintain our resistance long enough for him to decide we're more trouble than we're worth, Clara said. And whether we can do it without destroying everything Papa has built here in the process. Her father squeezed her hands, and when he looked up, some of the old strength had returned to his eyes. Clara, what I've built here isn't a building or an institution. It's relationships with people who care about each other and work together to make their community better. Charles Whitmore can threaten the building, but he can't destroy what really matters unless we let him. Then we don't let him, Clara said simply. We go to that meeting this afternoon and we remind everyone what really matters. We show them that standing together is stronger than surrendering separately. And if we lose? Her father asked, quietly. Then we lose fighting for what we believe in instead of living on our knees, Nancy said firmly. I'd rather see this church burn to the ground than watch it become a monument to one man's greed and cruelty. Luke stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street where people were beginning to gather in small groups, their conversations animated and their expressions serious. Looks like word about this afternoon's meeting has reached everyone. In town, he observed, and from what I can see, folks are taking sides. Clara joined him at the window, noting the way people seemed to be clustering into distinct groups, some looking toward the church with expressions of support, others with clear disapproval. The division in the community was becoming visible, and she wondered if they were witnessing the beginning of a permanent fracture that would never fully heal. Second thoughts? Luke asked quietly, echoing Nancy's earlier question. More like growing determination, Clara replied. Look at them, Luke. These are good people trying to figure out how to do the right thing in an impossible situation. They deserve better than being manipulated and threatened into compliance with something they know is wrong. Even if standing up costs them more than they can afford. Clara considered the question seriously, watching Mrs. Henderson talking earnestly with a group of women outside Porter's general store, her face animated despite the recent loss of her family's farm. Everyone has to make their own choice about what they can afford to lose, but they should make that choice based on honest information, not fear and manipulation. And what if the honest information convinces them that supporting us is too dangerous? Then at least they'll have made a free choice instead of being coerced into submission. Clara turned from the window to face the three people who had become her closest allies. That's all I've ever wanted, the right to choose my own path, even if it leads somewhere difficult. I can't ask for more than that, and I won't accept less. Nancy rose from her chair with the decisive movement of a woman ready for action. Well then, we'd better make sure this afternoon's meeting gives people the information they need to make informed choices. Clara, are you ready to tell your story to the entire town? As ready as I'll ever be, Clara replied, though she could feel butterflies beginning to dance in her stomach again. Remember, Luke said, you're not trying to convince everyone to agree with you. You're just trying to make sure they understand what's really at stake. What do you think is really at stake? Clara asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Luke was quiet for a moment, his brown eyes thoughtful as he considered the question. I think what's at stake is whether Millbrook remains a community where people take care of each other, or becomes a place where one powerful family controls everyone else's choices. That's bigger than your marriage or even your father's church. That's about what kind of place this town becomes for the next generation. Clara felt a shiver of recognition at his words. That was exactly what she had been feeling, but hadn't been able to articulate. This wasn't just about her personal freedom or her father's financial problems. It was about the soul of their community and whether ordinary people would have any voice in shaping their own futures. "Then we'd better make sure we win," she said. As they prepared to leave for the church, Clara caught sight of herself in Nancy's hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had stood at her bedroom window a week ago, watching her wedding day approach with dread. This woman looked determined, focused, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Her eyes held a confidence that hadn't been there before, and her posture suggested someone who had found her footing on uncertain ground. "You look like a woman with something important to say," her father observed, appearing beside her reflection. "I feel like one," Clara replied. "Papa, whatever happens this afternoon, I want you to know that I'm proud to be your daughter. You taught me that faith means acting on your principles, even when the outcome is uncertain. That's what I'm doing today. And I couldn't be more proud of you, sweetheart. Your mother would be too." As they walked toward the church together, Clara noticed that the groups of people in the street had grown larger and more animated. Word of the afternoon's meeting had clearly spread throughout Millbrook and beyond, and it seemed like half the county was planning to attend. She saw familiar faces mixed with strangers, supporters standing alongside critics, and enough tension in the air to suggest that whatever happened next would be remembered for years to come. "Nervous?" Luke asked, falling into step beside her. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but also strangely excited. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. This is your chance to stand up for what you believe in front of everyone who matters to you. That's both scary and exhilarating." "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make everything worse instead of better?" Luke stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but reassuring. "Clara, you've already made things better by refusing to accept a situation that was wrong. Whatever you say this afternoon, you'll be speaking from your heart about principles that matter. That's never the wrong thing to do. Even if it costs us everything? Especially if it costs us everything. Some things are worth more than security or convenience." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the conviction in his voice. "How did you get so wise, Luke Harrison?" "By making enough mistakes to learn the difference between what matters and what doesn't," he replied, "and by meeting a woman brave enough to remind me that some fights are worth having regardless of the odds." As they reached the church steps, Clara could see that the sanctuary was already filling with people, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation and anxiety. In a few minutes, she would stand before this gathering and make the case for her choices, for her father's integrity, and for the kind of community Millbrook could become if people chose courage over compliance. The outcome was uncertain, the risks were real, and the consequences of failure would affect not just her, but everyone she cared about. But for the first time in months, Clara Bennett felt like the author of her own story rather than a character in someone else's narrative. Whatever happened next, it would be her choice to make, and that, she realized, was worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Part 5. The Reward. The sanctuary of St. Matthew's Methodist Church had never held so many people in its 30-year history. Every pew was packed, with additional chairs borrowed from neighboring buildings lined along the walls, and people standing wherever they could find space. The air was thick with nervous energy, whispered conversations, and the weight of a community about to decide its own future. Clara stood in the vestry beside her father, looking through the small window that gave her a view of the assembled crowd. She could see familiar faces scattered throughout the sanctuary, mixed with strangers who had traveled from neighboring towns to witness what everyone seemed to understand was more than just a local dispute. In the front row, Charles Whitmore sat with Theodore and several well-dressed men she didn't recognize, their expressions confident and predatory. "It's time, sweetheart," her father said gently, his hand steady on her shoulder, despite the tremor she could hear in his voice. Clara nodded, smoothing her simple blue dress and checking that her hair was still properly pinned. She had chosen her appearance carefully, wanting to look respectable and serious without appearing to put on airs. This wasn't a performance, she reminded herself. This was simply a daughter speaking truth about her family's situation and asking her community to remember who they really were. The murmur of conversation gradually died as Clara and her father entered the sanctuary together. Luke was waiting near the pulpit, his presence as reassuring as it had become essential to her sense of courage. Nancy Porter sat in the third row, her steel-grey hair perfectly arranged, and her expression radiating the kind of fierce determination that had made her a formidable ally. Reverend Bennett stepped to the pulpit first, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. "Friends and neighbors, we're gathered today not for worship, but for something equally sacred, the pursuit of truth and justice within our community. My daughter Clara has asked for the opportunity to address you directly about recent events, and I believe she has earned that right through her actions and her character." He stepped aside, giving Clara an encouraging nod as she approached the pulpit. The silence in the church was complete now, broken only by the soft rustle of clothing and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Clara looked out over the sea of faces, some supportive, some skeptical, many simply curious about what she could possibly say to justify the scandal she had created. "Thank you all for coming," Clara began, her voice stronger than she had expected it to be. "I know many of you have questions about my behavior last Sunday, and I appreciate the opportunity to answer them honestly." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "I want to start by acknowledging the shock and disappointment my actions caused. Walking away from my own wedding was not a decision I made lightly, and I understand that it appeared selfish and ungrateful to many of you." A murmur ran through the congregation, some nods of agreement visible among the crowd. "But I hope that by the time I finish speaking today, you'll understand that my choice was not about rejecting duty or responsibility. It was about recognizing the difference between duty that honors our values and obligation that destroys them." Clara's gaze found Charles Whitmore in the front row, his face set in lines of barely controlled anger. "3 months ago, Mr. Whitmore approached my father with what appeared to be a generous offer. His son would marry me, and in return, the Whitmore family would ensure our church's financial stability. What Mr. Whitmore didn't explain was that he had already purchased our church's debts from the bank, giving him the power to destroy my father's ministry if we refused his proposal." Gasps and exclamations erupted throughout the sanctuary. Clara waited for quiet before continuing. "I don't say this to blame Mr. Whitmore for conducting business according to his own standards. I say it to help you understand that what was presented as a generous offer was actually an ultimatum backed by the threat of financial ruin." "That's a distortion of the facts!" Theodore's voice cut through the church as he rose from his seat. "My father made a legitimate business proposition that would have benefited everyone involved. Miss Bennett is twisting the situation to justify her own irresponsible behavior." Clara looked directly at Theodore, seeing him clearly for what he was, a man who had never questioned his right to take whatever he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. "Mr. Whitmore, you're absolutely correct that your father made a business proposition. That's exactly my point. He treated my marriage as a business transaction, with my consent as irrelevant to the negotiations as it would be in any other commercial exchange." She turned back to the congregation, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But the real issue isn't what happened 3 months ago. It's what has happened since I refused to honor an agreement I never made. In the past week, the Henderson family has lost their farm after publicly supporting my father. Jim Murphy was fired from his job at the lumber mill for the same reason. Other families have been threatened with similar consequences if they continue to show loyalty to the Bennett family. The murmur from the crowd was louder now, with clear notes of anger and indignation. "These aren't coincidences," Clara continued. "They're systematic punishment designed to show this community what happens when you oppose Charles Whitmore's will. He's using economic pressure to force conformity, just as he used it to force my compliance with his son's marriage proposal." Charles Whitmore finally stood, his face flushed with rage. "Young woman, you are making serious accusations without any proof. I have conducted all my business dealings according to standard practices, and I will not sit here and allow you to slander my family's reputation." "Then let's examine those standard practices," Clara replied calmly. "Is it standard to purchase debt specifically to gain leverage over the debtors? Is it standard to demand marriage as collateral for financial assistance? Is it standard to retaliate against employees and customers who express opinions you disagree with?" The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Clara could see people throughout the congregation exchanging glances, some looking troubled, others appearing to see the situation clearly for the first time. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't question your right to conduct business as you see fit, but I do question your right to control other people's personal choices through economic coercion, and I question this community's willingness to accept that kind of control as the price of prosperity." Clara moved away from the pulpit, walking closer to the congregation as she made her final appeal. "The truth is that my father found himself in an impossible situation through no fault of his own. He had borrowed money to help families in need, to repair damage from last spring's floods, to provide medicine and food for people who had nowhere else to turn. When those debts came due and he couldn't meet them, Mr. Whitmore offered what seemed like the only solution available." She looked directly at her father, seeing the pain and pride warring in his expression. Papa was willing to sacrifice his daughter's happiness to save his ministry and protect the people who depend on this church. That's the action of a man who takes his calling seriously, and I honor him for it. But I couldn't be part of a solution that required trading my future for debt forgiveness. Clara turned back to face the full congregation, her voice ringing with conviction. "I believe this community is capable of better solutions than that. I believe we can find ways to help each other that don't require anyone to compromise their principles or surrender their freedom. I believe Millbrook is strong enough and good enough to solve its own problems without accepting control from anyone who thinks wealth gives them the right to dictate other people's lives." The church was completely silent now, every person focused intently on Clara's words. "But I need your help to prove that belief is justified. We can work together to address the church's financial needs through community fundraising, volunteer labor, and mutual support. We can show other towns and other powerful men that Millbrook won't be bought or intimidated. We can build something, here that's based on cooperation instead of coercion." Clara paused, looking around the sanctuary one more time before making her final plea. "Or we can accept that money matters more than morality, that power trumps principle, and that young women are commodities to be traded rather than human beings with the right to choose their own destinies. The choice is yours, and whatever you decide will determine not just my fate, but the kind of community Millbrook becomes for your children and grandchildren." She stepped back, her heart pounding, and waited for the response. For a long moment the silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of decision. Then, slowly, Nancy Porter rose from her seat in the third row. "I've lived in this town for 35 years, Nancy said, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I've seen good people struggle and bad people prosper, and I've watched too many folks accept injustice because they were afraid to fight it. Today, Clara Bennett showed us what real courage looks like. I, for one, am ready to stand with her." As Nancy sat down, Mrs. Henderson slowly rose from her seat in the middle of the church. Despite losing her family's farm to Whitmore's retaliation, her voice was steady and clear. "My husband worked our land for 43 years. We lost it this week because we had the courage to speak well of Reverend Bennett and his daughter. If that isn't proof of what Mr. Whitmore is capable of, I don't know what is. Clara's right about him, and she's right about us. We are better than this." One by one, people throughout the congregation began to stand. Jim Murphy, whose job at the lumber mill had cost him his livelihood. Young Tommy Henderson, whose family had been destroyed by Whitmore's vindictiveness. Sarah Mitchell from the general store, whose husband worked for one of Whitmore's business partners. Ranch hands and shopkeepers, mothers and grandfathers, people who had spent their lives keeping their heads down, finally deciding to lift them up. Within minutes, more than 2/3 of the congregation was on their feet, their faces set with determination that surprised even Clara with its intensity. Charles Whitmore looked around the sanctuary with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that his control over the community was dissolving before his eyes. "This is preposterous," Theodore declared, his voice cracking with panic. "You're all being manipulated by a hysterical woman who's embarrassed about her own poor judgment. None of you have the resources or organization to solve this church's financial problems, and you'll regret this emotional decision when reality sets in." "Maybe we will," said a voice from the back of the church. Everyone turned to see Luke Harrison stepping forward, his hat in his hands, but his expression radiating quiet confidence. "But I'd rather regret trying to do what's right than spend the rest of my life knowing I surrendered to a bully without putting up a fight." Luke looked directly at Clara, and she saw something in his brown eyes that made her heart race with more than gratitude. "Besides," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed sanctuary, "some things are worth fighting for regardless of whether you're sure you can win. Some people are worth standing up for even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted." Clara felt tears of joy and something deeper than joy spilling down her cheeks. Around her, she could see the faces of her community, people who had chosen to stand with her despite the risks, despite the uncertainty, despite Charles Whitmore's threats and Theodore's dismissive arrogance. "Very well," Charles Whitmore said, his voice cold with fury as he rose from his seat. "You've made your choice, and now you'll live with the consequences. But don't come crying to me when this romantic foolishness collapses and you're left with nothing but debt, regret, and a community divided against itself. The church foreclosure will proceed as scheduled, and anyone who has supported this rebellion will discover that there are serious costs to making an enemy of the Whitmore family." As Charles and Theodore stalked toward the church doors, followed by their handful of supporters, Clara felt a mixture of triumph and terror. They had won this battle, but she knew the war was far from over. "What happens now?" someone called out from the congregation. Clara looked around the sanctuary, seeing determined faces mixed with uncertain ones, people who had committed to a fight they weren't entirely sure they could win. "Now we prove that we meant what we said," she replied. "We organize ourselves. We work together. We show Charles Whitmore and anyone else who might be watching that Millbrook doesn't surrender to intimidation." "And if we fail?" another voice asked. Clara thought about the question seriously before answering. "If we fail, at least we'll fail on our own terms, fighting for what we believe in rather than living on our knees. But I don't think we're going to fail." As the congregation began to disperse, people stopping to offer their support and ask how they could help, Clara found herself surrounded by the warmth of community in a way she had never experienced before. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were partners in creating the kind of future they wanted for themselves and their children. "Miss Clara?" Luke appeared beside her as the crowd began to thin, his expression mixing admiration with something deeper and more personal. "Might I have a word with you, privately?" Clara nodded, following him outside to the small garden behind the church where her mother had planted roses years before her death. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and the air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. "That was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed," Luke said quietly. "The way you spoke to them, the way you gave them hope and a vision of something better than what they'd accepted. I've never seen anything like it." "I was terrified the entire time," Clara admitted. "I kept thinking about all the ways it could go wrong, all the people who might suffer because of my choices. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is, Clara. Not the absence of fear, but right action in spite of it." Clara turned to face him fully, seeing the warmth and admiration in his eyes, and feeling her own heart respond to the tenderness in his expression. "Luke, about what you said in the church, about some people being worth standing up for." "I meant every word," he said, stepping closer. "Clara, I know this isn't the ideal time for such conversations, and I know you have more pressing concerns than whatever's developing between us. But I need you to know that regardless of what happens with Charles Whitmore, regardless of whether we succeed or fail in saving the church, I want to be part of your future, if you'll have me." Clara felt her breath catch at the sincerity in his voice, at the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and miraculous. "Are you asking me to marry you, Mr. Harrison?" "I suppose I am, Miss Bennett, though I realize it might seem presumptuous given that you've just escaped one unwanted engagement." "The difference," Clara said, reaching up to touch his face, with wonder at how right it felt, "is that this time I'm being asked rather than told. This time the choice is mine to make freely." "And what choice are you making?" Clara felt a smile spread across her face, bright and joyous, and full of possibilities she had never dared imagine. "I'm choosing you, Luke Harrison. I'm choosing a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. I'm choosing love over convenience, principle over security, hope over fear, and freedom over safety." Luke's answering smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, holding her close among the roses her mother had planted as a symbol of beauty that could flourish even in difficult soil. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together," he said, and kissed her as the church bells began to ring, calling the community to evening prayers and to whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. 9 months later, Clara Bennett Harrison stood in the same rose garden, wearing a dress of cream-colored silk that she had chosen herself and holding a bouquet of flowers that Luke had picked from their own garden at the small ranch they were building together 5 miles outside Millbrook. The church behind her was debt-free, saved by the most successful community fundraising effort in East Texas history, with contributions pouring in from as far away as Dallas and Houston after word spread about Millbrook's stand against economic intimidation. Charles Whitmore had eventually abandoned his threats when negative publicity about his business practices began affecting his lumber sales throughout the region, and federal marshals made it clear that his debt collection methods were being closely scrutinized. He had left Millbrook entirely, selling his properties to local buyers and taking his family to seek opportunities in less resistant communities. Luke waited for Clara at the garden's entrance, handsome in his best suit and smiling with the joy of a man who had found everything he had never dared hope for. Around them, the same community that had stood with her in that moment of crisis now gathered to celebrate her choice to marry for love rather than obligation, to build a future based on partnership rather than control. As they spoke their vows, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors who had become something closer to family, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a terrified woman in a runaway carriage, a cowboy brave enough to risk everything for strangers, and a preacher's daughter who learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith is choosing your own path. It had led to this, a love forged in the crucible of shared struggle, tempered by mutual respect and strengthened by the knowledge that the best partnerships are built by people willing to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. As Luke kissed his bride under the Texas sky, the church bells rang out across Millbrook, calling the community to celebrate not just a wedding, but the triumph of principle over power, love over obligation, and courage over fear. It was, Clara thought as she looked into her husband's eyes, and then out at the faces of people who had become her chosen family, exactly the kind of future worth fighting for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.